Hello guys, welcome back to our anime explainer. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Soul Land 2 Peerless Tangmen based on novel. So let's start. What is this? Undoubtedly, it was another soul tool that Huo Yuhao had never seen before. However, just because he had never seen it before didn't mean that it wasn't dangerous. His senses were also very acute. Although the white halo had yet to reach him, he could judge that it wasn't offensive or lethal. However, it contained gentle undulations and a spiritual aura. Spiritual type, oscillation detector. Once-off thing. This isn't good. It's trying to locate my position. After a brief moment of judgment, Huo Yuhao immediately reacted. The white halo covered more and more area as it spread out. At first, it was only a meter wide. However, it instantly grew to more than 100 meters wide, and it continued to expand further. At such a speed, it would be more than 500 meters wide by the time it reached Huo Yuhao. There wasn't any way he could avoid it if it expanded to that width. At this critical moment, Huo Yuhao's decisiveness developed during the ultimate soldier plan played a prominent role. He put his flying type soul tool away without any hesitation, and allowed himself to freefall. He might possibly enter the surveillance range of the Sun Moon Empire's surveillance soul tools. However, he wasn't willing to be engulfed by the white halo even if he ran the risk of doing just that. He could sense a lethal threat from that non-lethal, inoffensive white halo. He fell very quickly. The wind around him was extremely strong, but Huo Yuhao's spiritual power kept him focused on the white halo. His quick reaction saved him. That white halo swept past his head, and only slowly dissipated around 10 kilometers from the mountain peak. As it swept past his head, Huo Yuhao immediately confirmed his judgment earlier. He was right. There wasn't any strong aura within that white light. However, it clearly contained some kind of special frequency wave, as well as a light spiritual aura. That was sufficient to determine the position of anyone it ran into. As he fixed his gaze on the mountain peak, Huo Yuhao could subtly see a dim red object flashing slightly before disappearing. Lucky. If his position had been determined, he might have been struck a deadly blow in the next instant. What kind of power does this mountain peak possess? Its defense is actually so strong. My spiritual power only slightly touched the barrier before such a huge reaction was sparked. As he thought to himself, Huo Yuhao summoned his soul power and reduced the momentum of his fall. His imitation was fully unleashed before he slowly opened his butterfly-winged flying-type soul tool. He couldn't open it too quickly, as he was falling too fast. If things went amiss, his flying-type soul tool would be destroyed. As he lowered his head to look at the detector on his wrist, Huo Yuhao cursed to himself. This short period of free fall had caused his altitude to fall from 3,500 meters to 2,500 meters. He was within the range of the Sun Moon Empire's surveillance soul tools now. Even though there were only a few soul tools that could detect him, he would have raised alarm bells by now. Very soon, he was sure to be the focus of all surveillance. What should he do? Every time he was in such a crisis, Huo Yuhao was always stimulated to the best of his potential due to the massive pressure. This time was no exception. He knew that his surveillance mission today would be unlikely to yield too much progress. However, it wasn't a complete failure. At least he had managed to see what was going on at the mountain peak. He had to return now. He managed to halt his free fall, and changed his unidirectional detection to an all-around detection, sensing the changes coming from the Ming Dou mountain range. At the same time, he unleashed his spiritual interference while using his imitation. With his spiritual interference, hundreds of square meters of air around him were covered in invisible spiritual undulations. Any form of surveillance that entered this region would certainly be affected. Just like Huo Yuhao had judged, the Sun Moon Empire's reaction was quick. It was just a matter of seconds before several surveillance soul tools were up around Huo Yuhao. These soul tools employed virtually all the types of surveillance abilities that were available. All that surveillance was focused on Huo Yuhao. They were directly aimed at the region below where the white light had passed earlier. The Sun Moon Empire's experience in terms of reconnaissance through surveillance Sol tools impressed Huo Yuhao. They must have concluded that he couldn't possibly fly upward, and could only choose to descend. At such an altitude, he couldn't gain any speed if he tried to fly. Furthermore, they clearly didn't locate him earlier, though they were clearly studying the region he was in right now. He turned around immediately. He couldn't care about being exposed now. He opened his flying type Sol tool fully, and turned into a streak of flowing light, before charging toward the military base of the Star Luo Empire. Behind those surveillance Sol tools, a dozen figures continued to chase him. Without a doubt, the Sun Moon Empire had sent out their most outstanding Sol engineers. Huo Yuhao was very impressed with how the Sun Moon Empire was able to seal off all counter-surveillance on them. His appearance drew great attention from the Sun Moon Empire. Someone powerful from the Sun Moon Empire gave out instructions that Huo Yuhao had to be killed, no matter the price. A spiritual type, Soul Master that could perform long-range surveillance was too important for the Star Luo Empire. However, it was very rare to find such a Soul Master, so the Sun Moon Empire was determined to kill him. The Sun Moon Empire's judgment of Huo Yuhao was also very accurate. They didn't think that the Star Luo Empire had any soul tools that could perform long-range detection. Since it wasn't a soul tool, it had to be a soul master. When Huo Yuhao unleashed his full strength, his release of soul power reached a maximum immediately. This was something ordinary soul masters couldn't do. Releasing soul power was generally something that required a process. Releasing soul power at such an immense speed might cause damage to the passageways of ordinary soul masters. In fact, it might be so damaging that it was life-threatening. This was especially relevant to soul masters whose soul power was very dominant. But Huo Yuhao didn't have any such problems. His body had gone through a major transformation through his immense spiritual power. His body was much stronger than most other soul masters. It was like he was using the body of a soul doluo, or title doluo, to control the soul power of a soul sage. He would be fine even if he unleashed all his soul power suddenly. The moment he tried to escape with full force, the surveillance soul tools behind had already roughly located his position. Among the figures that chased after him, the one that was leading the pack raised his hand before a ball of blinding golden light shot out. This ball of golden light shot like a shooting star towards Huo Yuhao. After around 100 meters, it suddenly blew apart, and turned into a huge patch of golden rain that engulfed the sky. Domain-type attack. His enemies had realized that Huo Yuhao's position could not be specifically determined. The purpose of this domain-type attack wasn't to kill Huo Yuhao, but to determine his specific position. At the same time, it would also slow his escape. Stationary soul cannon shell. So brutal. Huo Yuhao was also a soul engineer. He could tell how powerful that soul tool was, at least a Class 6 stationary soul cannon shell. The Sun Moon Empire was going all out with their efforts to kill him. Snorting coldly, Huo Yuhao maintained his speed. A deep blue projection suddenly appeared behind him. It was the Snow Lady. The Snow Lady sat on Huo Yuhao's shoulder. Her slender figure resembled that of a teenager right now. Her face looked as refreshing, austere, and confident as ever. She raised her right hand as she faced behind him. Suddenly, the cold currents in the air started to gather at an alarming speed. As deep blue lights flashed, large patches of deep blue snowflakes appeared in front of the Snow Lady. These snowflakes weren't very evident in the night sky. However, they soon gathered to form a huge, deep blue whirlpool. The golden rain that chased him was quickly devoured by this whirlpool, and disappeared without a trace. The Snow Lady raised her head and looked at the sky. She pointed her left hand into the distance and a glaring, deep blue glow formed on her hand. Even though it wasn't as cold at an altitude of 2,500 meters, as compared to 5,000 meters, it was still much colder compared to the ground. To the Snow Lady, it was undoubtedly a great opportunity to demonstrate her abilities, and this was not even including the Star Anise Mysterious Ice Grass yet. The Star Anise Mysterious Ice Grass was on Huo Yuhao's other shoulder. An icy blue halo spread out before fusing with the Snow Lady, boosting her power. The Snow Lady's help undoubtedly exposed Huo Yuhao's position. However, Huo Yuhao had already managed to escape more than 10 kilometers from the Ming Dou mountain range within this short span of time. The Seoul engineers that were pursuing him charged forward at full speed, and drew closer and closer to him. However, it was at this moment that a snowstorm descended from the sky. Snowy dance of ultimate ice. The snowstorm brought an unprecedented chill, and wreaked havoc with the sharp snowflakes. Huo Yuhao's figure was once again concealed by the snowstorm. The Seoul engineers shot out more than 10 streaks of lights, but they weren't able to determine Huo Yuhao's position. They lost their way amid the snowy dance of ultimate ice before he disappeared. When they wanted to attack from all fronts, Huo Yuhao had already disappeared once again, along with his snowy dance of ultimate ice. Air or ground? The Seoul engineers in pursuit were all stuck. At a height of 2,500 meters, Huo Yuhao could either ascend or descend. The speed of surveillance Seoul tools couldn't compare to these outstanding Seoul masters, and were even lagging behind. By the time they managed to close the gap, Huo Yuhao would already have disappeared. One Seoul engineer said hatefully, "This guy can conceal himself. What should we do?" The leading Seoul engineer shook his head and said, "Everything's too hasty. We don't have time to prepare. Let's return first. I'm afraid there will be people from the Star Luo Empire coming very soon." The Seoul engineer who had spoken earlier twisted his lips and said, "They dare to come close to us. Aren't they afraid of being killed by the death god? I don't think they have the guts to do so. It's a pity that this guy has gotten away. The death god Doluo personally instructed us to catch him." Huo Yuhao was flying very quickly, and he knew that he was safe when his enemies didn't pursue him. Since that was the case, he chose to fly upwards. He flew back to a height of almost 3,000 meters with the help of his snowy dance of ultimate ice and spiritual interference domain, before he channeled all his strength to escape. Once he was safe, everything that he had just investigated surfaced in his mind. The defense on your peak is so tight, how can I discover what your concrete situation is like? What will happen if I unleash spiritual shock against the spiritual barrier? What's going to happen? Huo Yuhao could faintly see after some calculations that he could possibly tear that spiritual barrier open temporarily if he used spiritual shock. However, he could only tear it open temporarily, and his spiritual detection was not nearly enough to investigate the circumstances inside. Unless he snuck through the barrier himself in the short window of time that the spiritual barrier was torn open. This was the only way so that he could scout everything clearly. However, he would undoubtedly be within attacking range of the death god, and a single misstep could lead to obliteration. There were many things that Huo Yuhao could do to protect his life. For instance, he had his spectral demiplane. He considered whether he could phase into the spectral demiplane first after going through the barrier, and then return to his original space to continue investigating once everything was safe and settled down. However, he quickly refuted this idea, and the reason was simple: he needed time to enter the spectral demiplane. At least, he needed time for warm-up and preparation. He didn't need much time, 5 to 10 seconds were enough. However, would his enemies give him 5 to 10 seconds? Evidently, they wouldn't. This was like back when he and Wang Chua were trapped within Sunrise City. There were legions of Seoul engineers looking and patrolling around, and 2 evil Seoul masters, who were also titled Doluo, had locked onto them. They would undoubtedly be safe if they could jump into his spectral demiplane, but Huo Yuhao wasn't even confident in jumping over himself, let alone taking Wang Chua, Nan Shuishui, and Nan Qiuqiu together with him within such a short period of time. Therefore, he chose to burn his spiritual fire, and that eventually led to the tragedy of Wang Chua sacrificing herself. If he couldn't rely on jumping into his spectral demiplane, then he could only rely on his own abilities to investigate before forcing his way back out. However, that probability was way too low. Once the death god was unleashed, he would be obliterated. It was difficult to even run inside the spiritual barrier. Even though spiritual barriers were not like soul power barriers, which could create direct blockading effects, even somebody with spiritual power at Huo Yuhao's level would be mired within temporary confusion and a trance if they came into direct contact with it. Even a single moment of confusion and dazzlement would very likely be fatal. Is this really a mission that's impossible to complete? Huo Yuhao continued thinking, as he gradually flew back to territories controlled by the Star Luo Empire. He slowly descended and revealed himself in the air at the same time. Two silhouettes swiftly came close in mid-air, and they arrived before him in no time. They were Tang Wutong and Yi Gai, who were responsible for providing support for him in the sky. They could see that Huo Yuhao's eyebrows were tightly knitted together, and they immediately understood that Huo Yuhao's reconnaissance effort was probably a failure. They didn't ask much, and they escorted him towards the ground. Inside the commander's tent, the White Tiger Duke and Princess Jojo were both waiting there. The White Tiger Duke had returned to the observation deck after he sent Huo Yuhao away. Even though he was very far away, the White Tiger Duke could still see some faint sparkles and flashes in the distance. The White Tiger Duke only came down from the observation deck after Huo Yuhao met up with Tang Wutong and Yi Gai, and he returned to the commander's tent to wait for them. Shu Sansha and the others met up when Huo Yuhao touched the ground. Shu Sansha asked quietly, "What's the situation like, Yuhao?" Huo Yuhao laughed bitterly and shook his head. "No, I couldn't scout anything at all. Come, let's talk inside." Tang Wutong followed behind Huo Yuhao. When she saw Huo Yuhao returning, she felt as if something heavy was immediately lifted from her chest. Even she was a little surprised, since when am I so concerned about this fellow's safety? Shu Jojo came forward to welcome him personally once he entered the commander's tent. Huo Yuhao forced another laugh and shook his head. Shu Jojo's expression didn't change. She smiled faintly and said, "This is but our first try, and failure is the mother of success. Yuhao, everything's fine as long as you're back safe." Even though Huo Yuhao knew that she didn't really mean some of the things that she said, his mood was still lifted a little. He smiled back and nodded before he swiftly stepped towards and in front of the sand table inside the tent. The White Tiger Duke looked at Huo Yuhao and asked, "What's the situation like?" Huo Yuhao pointed to the Ming Dou mountain range's main peak and lowered his voice as he said, "If my judgment is correct, not only is the death god on top of this main peak, I'm afraid even its creator is there as well." Everybody was momentarily stunned when they heard his words. The death god's creator. The White Tiger Duke and Princess Jojo's expressions changed slightly. Yes. If there was such as a thing as the death god, then, naturally, there was a creator. This soul tool probably wasn't something that normal people could use. However, according to the intelligence that they had received, the death god Doluo hadn't appeared within the Sun-Moon Empire for 30 years. Did this mean that the death god Doluo was truly here in person? That individual, who was known as the existence closest to becoming a Class 10 soul engineer. Huo Yuhao didn't look at the White Tiger Duke and Princess Jojo's expressions. Instead, he recounted his reconnaissance mission in the sky and the circumstances that he had encountered in detail. Princess Jojo couldn't help but draw a cold breath when she heard Huo Yuhao speak of the spiritual barrier within a 1-kilometer radius encircling the main peak. This means that the death god Doluo isn't just adept with crafting soul tools like the death god, he's also talented in creating powerful spiritual type soul tools. The corner of Huo Yuhao's mouth twitched. Even though he didn't say anything in response, his expression was clear enough. This was common knowledge since he was the soul engineer closest to becoming a Class 10 soul engineer. How could he not know how to craft other kinds of soul tools? The White Tiger Duke then asked Huo Yuhao, "Yuhao, what do you think the class of this spiritual barrier is? And what is that white circle of light that tried to scan you?" Huo Yuhao didn't hesitate as he replied, "The spiritual barrier is definitely a Class 9 soul tool. Even though it's not as valuable as the death god, it's likely to be the most powerful spiritual type soul tool in the world today. The white light that was trying to probe me was undoubtedly also a Class 9 soul tool. Even though it could only probe outwards explosively and spontaneously, the area that it can cover is simply too great. 10 kilometers. Its detection uses both undulations and spiritual power, and it's possibly even more powerful than the spiritual barrier. Investigating the main peak with a thing such as this around is far too difficult." The White Tiger Duke and Princess Jojo's expressions became incredibly black after listening to Huo Yuhao's words. Just as he had said, a single mountain's peak had 3 Class 9 soul tools installed for defense and offense. This meant that this peak was completely locked down. They had all experienced Huo Yuhao's spiritual detection before even he couldn't complete this reconnaissance task properly under such circumstances. So there was no need to talk about them. The White Tiger Duke heaved a long sigh and said, "This expedition was too dangerous. Fortunately, you managed to react in time. Otherwise..." Huo Yuhao frowned a little as he lowered his voice and said, "However, my trip wasn't completely wasted. Duke, Princess, if my guess is right, the Death God is probably more powerful than we imagined him to be." "Eh? Even more powerful?" The White Tiger Duke and Princess Jojo couldn't help but draw cold breaths at the same time. The Death God had already massacred so many of their powerful soul masters the last time around. If it was more powerful than they had imagined, how powerful could it possibly be? Shu Jojo asked with great difficulty, "What aspect are you referring to, Yuhao?" Huo Yuhao lowered his voice and said, "Distance. Previously, I was about 8 to 9,000 meters away from the Ming Dou mountain range's tallest peak when I attempted detection. Suppose that the white light released from the main peak did reach me, and that would mean it had locked onto my position. This means an attack was bound to come right afterward. I could faintly feel that a red metal object flickered on the main peak, though it disappeared because the white light didn't touch me. My enemies didn't know what my cultivation rank was, and they must have had expended a lot of energy to activate that special Class 9 soul detector. They weren't afraid to consume energy, and that means they weren't about to let their efforts go to waste. If they were just going to send soul engineers to run me down, they shouldn't have any confidence of doing so at such a great distance from the main peak. In the end, they didn't know what kind of cultivation I possess. Therefore, the most likely case was that the main peak could launch a direct attack against me. Under those circumstances, during that time, only the Death God on the main peak would be able to kill me with one strike and with absolute certainty. This means that the Death God's attacking range could be more than 5 kilometers. In other words, it can reach 5 kilometers when it's unleashing an attack over an area, but it can reach further when it's attacking in a single direction. The White Tiger Duke clenched his right fist and pressed it against the edge of the sand table as he listened to Huo Yuhao's analysis. He contemplated momentarily as he lowered his voice and said, "That's very possible. If that's the case, the Death God would still have been able to cause us heavy losses the next time around if we had estimated its range at 5,000 meters. It's possible that even its range for area attacks can reach further than that. If that's the case, then the Death God is just too terrifying." Huo Yuhao said, "We can't make any other judgments about the Death God, because we are terribly short on information regarding it. I feel that we have to continue our reconnaissance missions, and we should only stop once we figure everything out about this soul tool. The Death God's attacking strength is far too frightening. Furthermore, its surrounding defenses are tight and strict. One can say that the Death God is the key to whether we will be able to break through the Sun Moon Empire's defensive perimeter. As long as we can do something to get rid of it, we will have very good chances of breaking through the Ming Dou mountain range's defensive perimeter. In the end, we have many soldiers and soul masters. Our forward push and momentum will be unstoppable once we break through this defensive perimeter." The White Tiger Duke answered, "But conducting any more scouting missions against them is just too dangerous. Furthermore, only you possess abilities like that, and I can't let you put yourself in harm's way again." Huo Yuhao smiled plainly and said, "That's fine, Duke. With this attempt, we have obtained a better understanding of the Death God. I will be even more careful next time, and I will not use spiritual detection rashly to investigate what's happening on the other side. You can rest assured that I will not treat my life like a joke." The disappointment in Huo Yuhao's heart had vaporized after tonight's investigation. If his opponents were too simple, they wouldn't trigger his fighting spirit, while the Death God's mysteriousness and how powerful it was piqued his interest greatly. He was the only successful product of Shrek Academy's Ultimate Soldier plan. Wasn't investigating the Death God the best platform to evaluate his ability as an ultimate soldier? The White Tiger was momentarily stunned as he stared at Huo Yuhao, who was overflowing with fighting spirit only true heroes come forward in times of trouble and difficulty. This youth was faced with almost impossible circumstances and a dead end, but he was still full of fighting spirit and wasn't in the least bit timid or afraid. He didn't just have laudable spirit, he also had confidence in his own abilities at the same time. He would push forward even in the face of impossible opposition, such a role model. Shu Jiujiu stared at Huo Yuhao, and strange lights flickered continuously in her beautiful eyes. This fellow is just too outstanding. If only I were a few years younger. The princess couldn't help but blush a little when those thoughts ran through her head. Dai Hao contemplated momentarily and said, I won't try to give you any more advice, Yu Hao, and I represent the Star Luo Empire's millions of citizens and thank you. As soldiers, it is our duty to protect our country so that our country's citizens will not suffer the cruelty and torment of war. From now on, please tell us if you need anything or any help with regards to your investigation, the Northwestern Field Army, and I will do everything we can to give you sufficient aid. Huo Yuhao nodded and said, thank you for your trust. I will go back first so that I can have a long and detailed think about this. All right. The White Tiger Duke and Princess Jiujiu also needed to digest the news that Huo Yuhao had brought back tonight. Huo Yuhao returned to his room and crossed his legs on his bed. Images and scenes of his reconnaissance mission targeting the Ming Dou mountain range's main peak surfaced in his mind continuously, and he didn't let any single detail slip through his fingers. With his superior memory, everything that he had experienced just now replayed over and over again his mind with almost complete accuracy. Is there really no weakness or loophole? Huo Yuhao opened his eyes again after 2 hours, and his eyebrows were tightly locked together. He had attempted many different conjectures in his mind again and again, but every single conjecture ended up at a dead end with no exception. Charging through the spiritual barrier created by the Class 9 soul tool wasn't difficult, but the hard part was how he could come back out alive. Furthermore, investigation required time once he was inside, and would that mysterious death god Dolor give him the time he needed? His eyes slowly turned golden, and 2 shadows were released from Huo Yuhao's body and took human form, the Skydream Iceworm and the Ice Jade Emperor Scorpion. Huo Yuhao lowered his voice and asked, Brother Skydream, Ice Empress, help me think of solutions. Do I have a chance from your perspective? The Skydream Iceworm said, yes, of course you have a chance. There was a sneer on his face when he spoke. Ah? Huo Yuhao looked at him in surprise. He had been racking his brains for such a long time to no avail, and the Skydream Iceworm immediately said he had a chance once he came out. The Skydream Iceworm sneered and said, you have forgotten one thing, Yu Hao. You have a powerful protector. If you factor this into your calculations, you may not even be able to die even if the death god gives you a direct hit. Huo Yuhao's eyes lit up and said, are you saying? The Ice Empress chimed in, we can't just let him just do bad things by attaching himself to you. He has to show some responsibility. There was no question that the Skydream Iceworm and the Ice Jade Emperor Scorpion were talking about the Beast God, who had a reverse scale attached to Huo Yuhao. The Beast God was afraid of Huo Yuhao attaining the godly seat and breaking through the human limit in the future. However, he was afraid of Huo Yuhao dying at the same time. If Huo Yuhao died, the great Star Dou Forest's fortune and destiny would be terminated, and that could be considered absolutely destructive for them. Therefore, Di Qian had to use his own strength to protect Huo Yuhao. Huo Yuhao squinted his eyes as he lowered his voice and said, Brother Skydream, Ice Empress, how much, do you guys think, of Di Qian's strength can be channeled through that reverse scale when it takes a destructive hit? The Skydream Iceworm said, attacking strength will be hard to say, but at least 80% of his defensive strength can be channeled. Previously, when he stopped you twice from feeling the God Realm's energy, he almost used a conversion technique to bring his aura to the surface of your body. Under such circumstances, you can almost directly pass on the impact of any destructive attack to his body. Di Qian is able to control a certain amount of spatial energy with his cultivation, and he can locate your position through the reverse scale and transfer his own strength through spatial energy. When you're in danger, you can use spiritual power to stimulate that reverse scale so that Di Qian's reaction can be even faster. Perhaps you can even rip him off a little. As for you, as long as there's enough defensive strength, you can at least run into your spectral demiplane. Of course, we also have to be extra careful. We should be alright as long as we don't take a direct hit from the light of the death god. Huo Yuhao's eyes slowly started to glow after he listened to the Sky Dream Iceworm's words. A crack had seemed to appear in the dead end from before. If that's the case, then we can. One day later, Huo Yuhao was up very early in the morning, and his spirits were a lot better compared to the previous day. For Huo Yuhao, there were many times when Donga was his everything. His conclusion that Tang Wutong wasn't Donga had affected him a lot, and investigating the death god became the best way for him to free himself. The pain in his heart became a lot lighter if he channeled his energies and emotions into this endeavor. He cast his gaze towards the east as he left his tent. He made use of the purple energy from the east that came in the early morning and cultivated his purple demon eyes. Huo Yuhao didn't give up on cultivating his purple demon eyes even though it had been raised to its limit. Cultivation had long since become the most important thing in his bones. Warm purple energy nourished his eyes and made his already extremely clear and transparent eyes even more glossy and full of luster, and the pale purple hues emanated an elegant and noble aura. Tang Wutong walked out from her tent, which was next to his. She saw Huo Yuhao, who was still cultivating on his side, once she came out. Tang Wutong realized to her surprise that she felt a little dazed when she concentrated on Huo Yuhao. In that moment, she felt as if his entire being had integrated into the air, and it seemed like his body was part of the sunlight and the air. This clairvoyant and penetrating feeling didn't have a single trace of impurity. How can that be? She felt like she had only had this feeling from her father before. His soul power was like great waves, and his blood qi was like mercury. With every breath that Huo Yuhao took, the qi and blood in his body, his soul power, and his spiritual power fused together almost perfectly, and circulated at the same time. Huo Yuhao subconsciously felt as if his cultivation was improving again. For Huo Yuhao in his current state, a pure improvement in his soul power was not enough to satisfy his needs. It was more important for him to feel the great laws of heaven and earth during the process of cultivation. Previously, he had only managed to gain that blessing from the aura of the world during his moments of deep contemplation. Huo Yuhao stood there for an hour. He exhaled a long breath when the soul power in his body followed the mysterious heaven techniques pathways back into his dantian. The air became mist and was thin like a thread, but condensed without dissipating. This stream of air reached 100 meters, and it stretched through the sky like a fine white line. Light flickered beneath Huo Yuhao's eyes, and golden light erupted from them. The white mist was swiftly converted into thin threads in the next moment, and these threads wrapped back around as they merged into circle after circle of light, before they re-entered his body. Huo Yuhao's three energies reached their peak condition in that moment. There seemed to be mystical energies resonating around his body, and the vital energies of heaven and earth seemed to gather towards him with a speed visible to the human eye with every breath that he took. Even though they quickly dissipated from his body after that moment of aggregation, one could tell with a closer look that the most important parts of the vital energy of heaven and earth that was released after absorption had disappeared, as if those most important parts had been completely fused into Huo Yuhao's body. This continued for almost another hour, and the sky was almost completely bright by now. The sudden onset of Huo Yuhao's conscientious state of cultivation ended. Huo Yuhao's soul power had improved a little. More importantly, his spiritual energy and soul power had developed more chemistry, and it was the same with his blood and qi as well. This feeling is just fantastic, and it seems like the previous night's danger was also quite stimulating for my potential. Huo Yuhao walked towards the canteen with a satisfied smile on his face. He was about to wash up before having some breakfast. Hey! An exclamation suddenly stopped him in his tracks. Eh? Huo Yuhao turned around, and he saw Tang Wutong with her hands on her waist and an angry-looking demeanor. She seemed like she was covered with a layer of golden light under the light of the morning sun, and her pinkish-blue hair was colored with another dash of gold. She was as pretty could get. Is something up? No matter how beautiful Tang Wutong was, She already had a different place in Huo Yuhao's heart once he concluded that she wasn't Wang Dong. Tang Wutong was very upset. That fellow had been standing there for 2 hours, and she actually watched him from the side for 2 hours. In the end, this guy turned around and walked off after his cultivation, without even giving her a single glance. She could tell from his tone that he evidently hadn't noticed her presence. Tang Wutong glared at him as she asked, "To think you're known for your spiritual power? There's a living human being standing right next to you, didn't you see?" Huo Yuhao said apologetically, "I'm sorry. I was too into my cultivation before this. Do you need anything else?" She stared at Huo Yuhao's clean eyes that were clearly a little distant. Tang Wutong was momentarily stunned. "Yes. I called him to stop him for nothing. But why do I feel like this fellow's current behavior and appearance is just so disgusting? It seems like this is worse than how he looked when he behaved like a pervert." This video will